Hello everyone, welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. Before I hand over to Humphrey Hawksley, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions and comments, if you can just wait for the microphone because we're broadcasting this live. Over to you.
Thank you, Millicent. Thank you all very much for coming. Excuse my touch of laryngitis, but I'm sure we'll get through it. We're here to actually debate what I think is the most crucial issue in the world today, because development, whether international development or not, or the lack of it, was behind the Maoist revolution in China, the Russian Revolution, the Weimar Republic, and a raft of other causes that we're seeing now. When one side of a community has something and the other side doesn't, you get fragile states, conflict, and war. What we're going to talk about today is what Britain should be doing with its international development budget, which is ring-fenced from cuts, unlike other British departments. But it's also going through a dramatic review of how it should be spent. Should more money go to conflict states, fragile states? And does that work? It might work in some places, but for example, the Yugoslav wars were nothing to do with lack of development. They were all very well developed communities. Should we still be giving money to India? It does seem a bit strange that India is building a space program and aircraft carriers and that sort of thing, but not yet supplying sanitation for its own people. But should we, as taxpayers in Britain, be paying for that? With us to debate this is a really very good panel, because they've all got a lot of experience in this. Paul Ackroyd, at the end here, has been an international development consultant working for DFID and other organisations for, what is it, 38 years, Paul, I think
something like that
you mentioned. There we go. Samir El-Awari is doing research on this precise issue that we're talking about, and we're going to ask him not for long sub-claused academic answers on this, but to get to the nub of the issue, even if he hasn't published it yet. Dorcas Erskine is the head of Action Aid, head of publicity at Action Aid, so she is in the sharp end of a charity working out in the field. And we've got a big cheese from DFID here too, who I've got next to me because he's actually going to answer the main questions here that we're all going to start challenging. Michael Anderson, the Director for Policy and Global Issues. I'm going to ask each of them for 4 or 5 minutes to sum up that if they had control of Britain's, is it £8 billion a year?
In that order now?
So about £8 billion a year. If they had control of that, what would they do with it and how would they change it? And then we'll play out some of the themes from that. So perhaps, Paul, if you could kick off with that.
I'll go first. Thank you. Right, well, I'm not going to give you a list of countries. What I'm going to do is try and give you a list of criteria from which I think the countries should be selected on, and with them we can let the discussion develop. Firstly, I think aid money should follow the poverty. That's what, to me, aid is about. It's about reducing poverty, achieving the MDGs and whatever. So aid should go to where the poor people are, and that's not a trivial point, because 80% of the poor people in the world live in not actually poor countries. They live in the middle-income countries. And there's an interesting discussions which are going on, I'm sure Michael will elucidate more on this, about what the balance should be between aid, proportion of going to aid to poor countries and the aid that goes to the middle-income countries, like Humphrey was saying, the Indias and the Chinas. That's where a lot of the poor people are. So I would follow the poor people. Second thing, I would follow governments that commit themselves to poverty reduction. There's a whole range of other things that governments do, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that unless you have a government which is in some way committed to poverty reduction, then you're probably wasting your money. So that's my second criteria, would be to seek out those governments that really are committed to poverty reduction and to back them. And the third one, which is kind of related to that, is I would do things, it's a sort of negative, I would not do projects. I consider the whole development industry, and as Humphrey was unkind enough to remind me how long I've been in it, took a wrong turn about 30 odd years ago, when we decided that the project was going to be the main delivery vehicle. and we can have a further discussion about what the problems are. But I think what we've ended up, what 30, 40 years of experience has shown, is that aid projects are a very bad way of delivering aid assistance. There are better ways. We've been experimenting with them. They're not perfect. There's program aid, there's budget aid, there's cash on delivery aid. I would avoid doing projects. With my fourth one is I would put more aid through multilateral channels, by which I mean the World Bank, the African Bank, the Asian Bank, the EC, even the UN, rather than spend it bilaterally. Now, that's not because I believe that those agencies are more effective or efficient than organizations like DFID. In fact, I don't believe they are. But I believe that the aid industry has become enormously ineffective. It's become ineffective because of the duplication of channels. There are too many people trying to do too many things. And I've been a strong supporter of the aid effectiveness agenda since it was promulgated in Paris some years ago. And I've been very disappointed at the behavior or the ability of the donors to actually organize themselves around it. But I think one way you could improve the aid effectiveness is to put more aid through fewer channels. That's why I use multilaterals. And my final one, which is another interesting one, which I hope we can have a debate, I put more money into people. Aid is not a simple thing to deliver. You need a good resource of people. You need knowledgeable people. And I hope Michael will comment as well. One of the things that worries me at the moment, certainly in DFID and some other agencies, is that the balance between the aid that is being spent and the people who are there, the knowledgeable people to spend it, is getting out of balance.
And if you had to sell this 5-point policy in a top liner to change what's happening now, how would you describe it?
I would say put the emphasis on things which improve the effectiveness.
It's not what they're doing at the moment, I think.
There are some elements there. They're moving in that direction, but there is I think a danger that we're going to move back towards forms of delivery which will be less effective.
Okay. And I just want to get in my mind, you talk about the projects, and the sort of stereotypical project is that old water pump somewhere. That you're saying, move away from that, and move on to something that will deliver that through another means.
Exactly. Do programs which deliver that, or if you like, don't build a school, but support a program, an education program.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Samir, I'd like you to specifically address the conflict, the humanitarian conflict thing that you're doing, but also in the same way.
Sure. Okay, well, I'll focus on the 30% of the budget that's targeted for fragile states. Now, I guess the first issue is the criteria for choosing the countries. Now, at the moment, Andrew Mitchell has stated that the key criteria is going to be looking at the countries at the greatest risk of instability, looking at where there's greatest interest for the UK, and also where we can have the greatest impact. Now, I think the reality is that very rarely we'll find the country which kind of fits all those three criteria. So I think we need to be quite specific about what the criteria we're going to be choosing on. And I think we need to make sure that we delink it from kind of national security issues and make it more linked to issues where there's greatest development, humanitarian and protection needs, and also looking at issues of impact. I guess the second issue, and I think where we do invest in contexts where there are national security interests, I think that for DFID we need to make sure that there are important red lines to make sure that development is not used as a means to kind of improving security. Now, I think a lot of the discourse kind of sees the two as mutually reinforcing. I think in some cases that could be the case, but I think in many cases it's not. And just to give an example, I think often when we have security or national security priorities kind of at the fore, we'll often see a concentration of resources in the areas where there's considered to be a greater national security risk, i.e., for example, where there could be the presence of terrorist organizations, rather than looking at potentially where there's greater risks of human security or security for populations. I think the third issue is maybe trying to rethink how we understand the development-security relationship. And I think often we see simply conflict as a failure of development or development have reverse. I think this is quite simplistic. I think we need to kind of see that often development itself is not value neutral, but can often be a process about whose version of development prevails. And I think it can be a conflicting process in itself. So I think we need to make sure that the type of development processes that we're instigating fit with the kind of society that local indigenous forces are trying to pursue as well. So I think focusing on politics and governance is central. I guess the fourth issue is just to recognize that there's a lot of limits about what international, I think, donors can do with regards to doing development in fragile states. And a lot of it will depend on kind of domestic endogenous processes. And I think, therefore, a lot of risks will need to be taken. And I think there's a tendency for development aid to be quite risk averse. And I think that if we are going to succeed in many of these fragile contexts, we do need to take risks.
Okay, I just want to something that I've been thinking about. In Yemen, for example, we have been giving aid for decades, and yet slowly it seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And now it's the new harbour for the new Al Qaeda in Arabia or whatever it is. When I ask you for your top line, is there a way that we can say, right, we're going to do it this way, but this way it's not going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and we can actually see a way through?
I think it's just how we understand instability, for example, in Yemen. So I think if you look at the criteria of USAID's development strategy in Yemen, it's very much about, they define instability as the presence of Al-Qaeda. So most of its development resources focuses on 3 provinces in which Al-Qaeda is deemed to be present, rather than trying to understand, well, what does instability mean more broadly, which could be about instability for the people in Yemen. It could be the fact that the government has dwindling resources that's coming through from dwindling oil revenues. So I think the way we understand the nature of fragility, I think, will be central.
But when we start throwing more money at Afghanistan or Yemen, all this sort of thing that might happen, is there a new formula to make sure that it is understood? Or is it just going to be like you say, well, let's go and build a school where Al-Qaeda is and hope for the best?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's going to work, and I think central is looking at the nature of the political settlement in some of these contexts. So I think in many cases, for example, looking at Afghanistan, you're supporting basically a government and trying to development through a government which lacks a lot of legitimacy, is kind of seen as partial, and ultimately excludes some key actors from that government. Now, those actors are seen as unsavory from our perspective, but I think if we're going to be realistic about results in that country, I think we need to start including people that we don't necessarily share the same values with, but play important parts in their own societies.
And the top line of your pitch?
Top line of my pitch, I guess, would be to, de-link engagement in fragile states with national security agendas.
Okay. Dorcas, give us your...
Oh, well, I'm really jealous because a lot of the stuff that Paul said, I wanted to say. So I'm really annoyed that I'm coming at this point. But never fear, because I was making like another sneaky list. So, because aid effectiveness is definitely one of the big ones that we definitely as ActionAid will champion. We always say it's aid quality, not aid quantity. And a lot of the arguments Paul has made fall into that. But I think it's a very fair question to ask us, because often we're the ones criticizing and making a fuss about what the government is not doing or not doing. But if I was sitting in Andrew Mitchell's chair right now, I would be thinking, well, what could I really do to bring about transformative change in the world for these countries? And I guess from our perspective, one of the major issues is about tax evasion, and it's about governance in these countries. So it's really brave for this government to sort of ring fence the aid budget at this particular time. What would be even braver, as some of these countries will tell you themselves, we were having a discussion about this before we came, is that, well, yeah, it's great we have this aid, we can build up this revenue authority, but when we want to sort of chase the companies that are evading their taxes, some calculations are that like this the sums for it are about 150 billion from Africa alone, and our aid budget is 8 billion, quite generous for the UK public. But you kind of think if those companies would pay their own taxes, maybe we might look at the end of aid dependency. If these governments could own their own resources, then maybe, you know, a woman sitting in Ghana can say, I know I paid my tax, like how we all have been doing in the comprehensive spending review. What is going to get cut? Because I paid my tax, you know, what's going on in my community? Maybe it would have better accountability and governance. I mean, that would be transformative. And that's difficult. That's difficult to do. It means negotiating with tax havens. It means bringing about different change. So I would like for us to do transformative development and not project-based development. That would be good. I would also like a really good understanding about the fact that women play a big role in development. And to be fair to DFID, you know, it's championed this, but let's get even a little bit more radical, because 70% of the world's poorest people are women. And like, not to be biased here, I think we're quite good at like sorting out affairs, and it would be really good to see women genuinely involved in development, and especially if we're going to focus on conflict states. I mean, we look at a country in Afghanistan that we work in, and we work with some amazing, very brave women who've got like great futures ahead of them, and we hope a good contribution for the country. So as we talk about getting out of Afghanistan or looking at how we'll do development in Afghanistan, let's talk to the women. Let's include them in the political process. You know, let's be a little bit brave. Let's be a little bit radical. That would be a really good thing to do. And I'm going to copy you because I feel really annoyed. It was my point, so I don't care that you said it. But I would really looking at governance and looking at investing in people. I think for ActionAid, what makes development is the people. So we learned that lesson. We used to, you know, go out to countries and build schools and feel really good, and like report back about the amazing things that we do, and we still do that to an extent. But we started to think, oh, if we're building the schools all the time, what is the government in that country doing? If we're doing these little project-based development, well, it lets the government off the hook, right? And the UK taxpayers paying aid, we know how much they're getting. Maybe we should let that community know how much we're spending in that community, how much that government is supposed to spend in that community. Maybe we should inform them of the rights of a constitution that they supposedly have but don't know anything about. Let's get there. Let's get them being more accountable. That's what I would say. So before you ask me what my top line is, it would be to invest in people and to like especially invest in women, if we could, please.
I'm not going to ask you your top line because that's really good. I just want to return to the tax evasion thing, because it's a little utopian in a way in many places. So could you just tell everybody here that in a nutshell what you told us about Rwanda downstairs, and then how would that work, say, in Yemen or Afghanistan?
Well, that's a different matter, isn't it? But okay, so you know, we don't often praise DFID enough, and you know, so I'll give Michael a lovely praise before. I'm sure when we debate, we get into like some nitty-gritty issues where we might not be so nice to each other. But in terms of, I went to Rwanda last year, and there are many other problems in that country with that with certain parts of governance that we're not entirely happy with, but that we'll put that to one side for a moment. And I went to see the Revenue Authority, which is led by a very interesting woman called Mary Bain, and she was telling me, look, Dorcas, you know, DFID gave us £10 million to build up a tax revenue authority. We now collect that amount in taxes every 2 weeks. You know, I mean, I was like, yeah, that's brilliant. And we have a Taxpayers' Day where we congratulate people, you know, small businesses for paying their tax. We tell people, oh, look, we built this school with your tax. So accountability, and that's really good. It's getting people involved. It's saying, okay, so, you know, there's a lot of tax evasion in different parts of the world. We talk about multinationals, but of course, small businesses in country, because they don't feel a purchase with what they pay with their taxes and what they get back from the state. So this is a really good initiative that like DFID can take a lot of credit for. You should just push the envelope out a bit more and make this more of a starlight policy.
Yeah, so is your top line essentially to tilt that balance of revenue coming in? That revenue, if the revenue comes from the citizens as opposed to from the multinational or the aid donor, then
Well, it's not an either or, because the first part of what I said was, as Mary said, we took, what, £10 million from DFID to build this program. You know, they didn't have it. It had to come from somewhere. So we need aid in order to take people from A to B. But aid isn't going to take us from A to Z. So we do need that infrastructure to be built up. That will be needed in countries that, you know, that's in Afghanistan, in Yemen. Someone has to provide that seed funding, and someone has to have the faith and take the risk. You know, so we do need that as part of the equation. They're not an either or.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. I think a couple of things to say by sort of introduction. One is that this government's been very clear that the reason the aid budget has been ring-fenced is because it's morally the right thing to do. And despite the huge cuts that are going across government, we're not going to balance the books on the backs of the poor. But also that there are very real UK national interests at stake. And they include control of disease, they include control of global poverty, they include control of conflict. All of those, climate change, all of those things relate to UK national security. I don't think we can wish away those national security aspects of the aid program. It's not that our decisions are driven by national security, but it is the case that aid is relevant to national security, and national security will feature. I do think, Samir, that, to be honest, I think the problem is blown way out of proportion. I think most of our aid is actually allocated in very sensible ways that don't have to do with pure national security interests. They're actually about human security, but we can have a really good debate about that in a little bit. That's one preface. The second thing is aid is a really important but limited part of development. And one of the most important messages is that DFID as an organization needs to be humble and to listen and to recognize that DFID is going to sometimes play a catalytic role, but the main development is going to be done by people in developing countries. And we're going to play a kind of cheerleader and supporting role, sometimes a critical role. And there are some really good stories. There's the Rwanda Revenue Authority. There are stories like the Orissa drug supply system in India, where we provided a small amount of technical assistance that brought down the price of drugs for people, basic drugs for people in Orissa by 50%. But most importantly is improved the clinical effectiveness of drugs in Orissa by about 800%. So that a lot of drugs were not clinically effective, then suddenly became. So we can do things that are really catalytic and important. But aid is important, but the big driver is what's happening in those countries, and the energy and enthusiasm and inventiveness and incredible determination is what makes development happen. So some humility is important. In terms of what we're thinking about, we are doing, as Humphrey mentioned, we're going through these big reviews. Reviewing our whole bilateral program, reviewing the multilateral assistance we give, all of the kind of cross-sectoral support we give, reviewing the research program. We have a big research program investing in scientific breakthroughs and so on, reviewing our humanitarian assistance. So everything's being scrutinized. And the top line, I'll give you in advance, Humphrey, which is its value for money. It is really looking hard at the question of where are we going to achieve the most with the scarce resources we have. And we know there are some key elements to that. One of them is supporting growth. Growth is the exit strategy for poverty. It's not aid is not the exit strategy, it's growth. And so how do we work better with private entrepreneurs? And there are some incredible entrepreneurs. Another part of our strategy is working much more closely with girls and women and championing that as a catalytic dimension to this. But part of that is the entrepreneurial energy that we see that can be unleashed among women. Making sure that women have access to family planning. There's a huge unmet need for family planning. It gives women much more control over their lives. Adolescent girls, a group that has been ignored for far too long, really targeting what can be done for adolescents. So growth, girls and women, paying attention to conflict and conflict reduction. Measuring the effectiveness of conflict prevention is really hard. It's intellectually a very challenging thing to do. But the best available estimates we have, the ones that there's a consensus, this is probably the best guess there is at the moment, is that for every pound you spend on conflict prevention, you save 4 pounds that might be spent later. So it's a really good investment. It's a sensible thing to be doing. Climate change could be more and more important. It's already critical. helping make investments that are going to be low carbon in the future, but also make countries better adapt, more resilient to climate change. So these are some of the key things, but the really core one is we're focusing down on results, really asking ourselves hard questions of what are we achieving. And there is, to be honest, there's a tension between measuring results on one hand and being strategic and transformative on the other hand. And we're going to have to get that balance right. But we're going to have to be much better at measuring what is effective, really having extensive scrutiny of what works well, and having a kind of culture of restless curiosity about what can we do to make aid work better, and be open to feedback on it. So the top line for me is value for money, and really, really be scrutinizing and pressing this hard. And I guess I would just associate myself with much of what the other three have said. I think it's very sensible things.
I mean, just to sort of sum up your top line, because there's a new government, a new Secretary of State in, and there is this issue of ring fencing. If you take the past 20 years of the record of aid, I'm not just saying what DFID's done, but what the Western democracies have done in places like Africa or wherever, what is the thinking of what was wrong and what was right, and how should things change? I mean, I'm sure that if we were having this debate 15 years ago, you would have said value for money, aid effectiveness. What is changing? What went wrong? I mean, Paul, these have touched on it a bit, but...
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would mention is just that aid is not just a Western venture. I mean, some of the Gulf countries, for example, Kuwait, has been giving 4% of its gross national product to aid for a very long time. And there is a risk that in Europe in particular, we tend to think that we have a monopoly on this.
Actually, when you see the donor lists, they're all Western countries, aren't they? You don't get China or Kuwait or...
Well, I mean, what you get often is the list of the OECD members.
Yeah.
And that's because there is the OECD Development Assistance Committee that kind of pulls all this data together. And China and the Gulf countries and so on don't belong to that club, so they don't end up on the lists. But actually, there has been a global aid venture that extends beyond Europe and North America for quite a long time in Japan. Lessons. We have learned a lot over the last 20 years, and we're still learning. We have learned that projects alone don't produce change. It's very easy to go into a village with some terrific volunteers and a wad of money and make a big change in that one village. But what we learned a long time ago is that changing one village alone doesn't change the system, and that governance is absolutely critical. We have learned a lot about better techniques of delivery. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. The revolution that's been going on in cash transfers, much of it driven by Latin America, measuring that if you actually just give people cash directly and link it in some cases to going to school or attending healthcare and so on, huge impacts can be achieved. But the only way we know that now is because the government of Mexico and Brazil in particular set up studies, really, really rigorous, methodologically rigorous studies to study the impact. So we've learned a lot because we've measured a lot more, we've researched a lot more, and we're still learning. I'm sure 20 years from now we'll look back and say, gosh, weren't they naive?
Value for money. I'd like to go around the panel on two topics. One's a negative, one's a positive, and then we'll throw it open to questions. We'll start on the negative. And the negative is essentially picking up from what we've done. If we look at Pakistan, for example, Afghanistan, lots of Africa, over the past 20 years, since, say, the end of the Cold War, Africa, I think, is sort of hovering. It's either gone backwards or just a little bit forwards, where other parts of the world have taken off. And I want to deal with the other parts of the world a little later. But what is the, Paul, what is the reason that a continent like Africa is state static, in conflict, very heavily on our television screens, despite a lot of aid going in there? And how can we learn from that?
Well, there's quite a lot of variation within Africa. I think we have to recognise that, first of all.
But I'm talking specifically to what the general public see on their television screens. So they're going to get Somalia or a riot in Kenya or something out, and they'll say, "Oh, Africa again," So
but it's a great shame that we haven't found a better way. I know DFID was investing quite a lot of money in putting out the good stories. It's really difficult to get the good stories on. the other thing is, aid in a sense is almost bound to fail in that aid tends to look for the difficult situations. You say that Africa's received lots of aid. Well, lots of aid went to Africa because Africa was failing. Aid donors have pulled out of one of the countries in East Asia because they're doing well. So you've got to be very careful about how
aid to East Asia and Africa was at a par, or if not more, to Asia back in the 1970s, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, you could argue, therefore, that aid to East Asia has been a great success because they've done well.
Right.
Right. So, and I think this comes back to Michael's point, which I fully agree with. Aid is pretty marginal in all these situations. In most situations, aid can make a difference, but it only makes a difference if other things are moving in the right direction. If other things aren't moving in the right direction, then aid is very likely. It might be a bit of a palliative, a bit of sticking plaster, but it isn't going to make a big difference.
What are the things?
The basic thing is governance. It comes back to governance, which was Dorcas' point, and I think we mentioned it. Is how the country is run. Governance is a portmanteau phrase for a number of different things. But essentially those countries which manage their own affairs, which manage their own resources well, manage aid well. And those that don't manage their own resources well, aid is not going to make a lot of difference. So it comes down to the way that societies organise themselves. And that is the biggest challenge, I think, for external people. How do we help countries to develop better governance systems?
So is there, Dorcas, is there if you agree or disagree with Paul, is there a line beneath which we shouldn't give aid because it's just going to go down? I mean, do we give aid to Somalia? I'm not sure. I mean, I think we pay for their whole government, don't we?
The clue to my answer lies in our name, Action Aid. No, I don't think. I am obviously not going to argue for. I don't really believe in this sort of aid pessimism, because I think it's true that aid goes to where need is needed most. At least that's the value we want to uphold. And development's difficult. We've been talking about, what have we learned over the past 20 years? Well, and people say so much aid has gone to Africa, it's all being wasted by these corrupt governments. But then let's take a step back and look at how that kind of aid was delivered. Let's look at the historical reasons in which aid was given in certain places, which is why intentions of donors count, which is why, things like aid effectiveness counts, because we hear all these loud sort of, all of this aid is going here, all of these big political announcements. But when you get down to the figures, you see very few countries are keeping their aid commitments as one. So maybe not as much aid as we think.
The donor countries aren't keeping,
countries as one. Another thing that you find is donors have a very interesting way of using aid for their own interest as well, which is why we have this value about poverty reduction as the focus. So you do find some interesting examples where I think we were looking at the G8 commitment to hunger that was made in Italy. I'm making it's related. Take your time. Wait. Wait. I'm making this point so that you can understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. You would look at some of very interesting announcements on tackling hunger around the world, and Germany had said to us that we've committed X amounts of money, X amounts of millions to hunger. And when we looked into the figures, we found out that they were using it for odor reduction in certain factories that were producing things for German products, food products in China. And so they classified that as good aid in terms of helping reduce hunger. So there's a lot of facts and figures that, really are behind all of this. All of this aid is going to these countries. Why haven't they pulled themselves out? Number one, aid is a small part of the solution. If other things aren't in place, then
I just want to clarify on this. You're saying that all the figures on aid that we're getting are all rubbish?
I'm not saying that. I didn't say that.
It needs to be more transparent about what goes to...
Well, I think DFID is quite good.
Yeah.
I think DFID is quite... I can't believe how much praise you're getting. I think DFID is quite good in that respect, but DFID isn't the only donor, and it can't carry all of development in the world, So when we talk about all of these figures, all this trillion amounts of money going to Africa, well, let's have a look at that. Let's see what donors have done. Let's
so
see
we
the
don't
quality
actually
of
know
the
how
aid.
much has been given and how much... I mean, there's no real accurate accurate record of it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are records, but we have some skepticism about some of those figures.
So there aren't. Samir, just to pick up on these points, I mean, Paul was saying that you need a certain level of good governance for it to work, but you don't have necessarily good governance in Afghanistan or the conflict states. So what should happen there? Should no aid be given?
Well, I mean, I think...
Or is it going to be a waste of money? Or what is it?
I mean, I think we've got to see what type of aid. So, I mean, I think at a minimum, I think we still need to continue and provide humanitarian assistance.
Okay, that's emergency humanitarian assistance, which is different from development aid.
Yeah, which is different development aid, but it comes from the same budgets.
Yeah.
Overall budgets. And but I think ultimately when we kind of decide to support governance in those areas, I mean, I think we need to be realistic. So take Somalia as an example. I mean, it's clear that we're trying to support the transitional federal government in Somalia, but there's issues around the lack of will and ability in terms of actually, achieving some of its functions. So if we are providing aid in that circumstances, we need to be realistic about what it's going to achieve. So I don't think we can realistically think that just providing aid is going to transform a society like Somalia with the kind of really endemic problems that Somalia has. So I think we need to start thinking about what are some of those problems, what are the roots of those problems, and how can we address them. And I think even in terms of Somalia, we need to start thinking that maybe supporting the TFG is maybe part of the problem. So we need to rethink.
Do we differentiate our aid from, say, the aid we give to Ghana, which is moving steadily in a good direction, to the aid we're giving to Somalia, which is basically at a status quo of warfare, isn't it? Is there a sort of is it categorized differently, or?
Well, I mean, I think the aid, in terms of the objectives and the programs of aid will be different. So, I mean, I think, in terms of Ghana, where you have a relatively kind of developed system and you have a relatively stable government, then the aid, maybe a lot of it's public, budget deficit support. Whilst in Somalia, then the issues are quite different because it's a government that, has practically been in exile for the last 10 years or so. And then there's, the systems are not in place to be able to provide assistance in that way.
So if you were sitting in the hot seat, as we've got you as the minister or prime minister, would you be committing that, is it extra 40 million or whatever million to Afghanistan now, or would you hold back on it?
No, I would be engaging in fragile states, and I think it's extremely important.
You would be increasing the budget to Afghanistan?
Well, no, not necessarily to Afghanistan. I think to fragile states more
the question's about Afghanistan.
Okay.
Would you be increasing the budget to Afghanistan by the amount that DFID plans to do it?
No, I probably wouldn't.
How much would you increase it by?
Well, I mean, I think you have to really look at the objectives.
Well, you've looked at them. Everybody's been looking at them for 20 or 30 years. We know the objectives. How much would you give to Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I'll look at the overall proportion that we have. So say that we are.
Well, what is the proportion, Michael, that we're... I mean, it was announced, wasn't it? There was 40% more or something going on?
That's right,
yeah. So there's a 40% more of British taxpayers' money is going to Afghanistan. Is that right or not?
Well, I mean, from a UK perspective, I don't think that's necessarily wrong. And I think if I were, as a UK taxpayer, and if there are British troops in Afghanistan and they're particularly interested in Afghanistan, spending the money there might not necessarily be seen as a problem. But I think if we are going to look at the wider picture, I think we need to kind of see, well, maybe there's other contexts where there's greater need than Afghanistan. But if we determine that the greatest need is in Afghanistan, then I don't see a problem investing it there. But I think that we do need to, it depends how we spend the money as well. So if we are using that money to, ensure that the to prop up the government when it's a government that is kind of has questionable legitimacy, then I think that's maybe problematic. But then I think
so. It is because you say a lot of ifs, but we know that there's a government. It is problematic, right?
Yeah.
That 40%, Michael, how much of it's going to go down the drain? How much of it's going to go into Swiss bank accounts?
Yes.
What percent of the 40% is actually going to work?
Yeah. I mean, look, a little bit of looking backwards. In 2001, there were 1 million children in school in Afghanistan. And today there's 6 million children in school in Afghanistan. In 2002, there were 9% of the Afghan population had access to basic health care. It's gone from 9% to 85%. I used to be an historian. In historical terms, global historical terms, that is a stunning transformation in a short period of time. I mean, it's just unbelievable in comparative history that you'd move so quickly. So Afghanistan is a place where it is hard to work, where we have to take a lot of risks, security risks, fiduciary risks. It is tough. And we know that it's a place where we have to get the development and the diplomacy and the defense working together. There's no other choice but to have that happen. We know that some of the things we try will fail, probably. But there are high returns to be had in a place like that. And a casual familiarity with history would suggest that development in a place like Afghanistan is going to be path dependent. There'll be steps backwards as well as forwards. And that a partnership which is there for the long term, that is prepared to provide resources. There are some incredibly determined human beings in Afghanistan who are really trying to rebuild the country.
Is it going to stop the Taliban taking over?
Well, I mean,
to what extent might it do that?
We're working at it. This is historically contingent.
Yeah.
And
there's a chance.
And there's a judgment to be made about how many resources are needed to prevent that from happening. Mm-hmm. We're making our best judgment at the moment.
So you essentially disagree with Paul. You've got bad governance in Afghanistan. I mean, we heard about Iranian dollar money bags coming in, and you've got dreadful government, election fraud, and all the rest of it. But it's still worth putting the money in, is it?
Yeah, I think one of the points is about. It is true that it's easier to achieve higher development returns in areas where there's good governance. So there's no doubt about that. And I think one of the untold stories, we talked earlier about Africa, is the incredible change that's taken place in Africa over the last 15 years in overall economic management. That we had this global downturn in 2008, and most African countries came out of it relatively unscathed. There were no huge debt crisis. There was no repeat of 1982. And actually, the management of the monetary policy and the fiscal position, incredibly good. We've had 54% growth in average incomes in Africa over the last 8 years. That is just terrific. So that's an untold part of the story that we've not captured. So obviously, where governance is better, it's easy to make progress. But we have to work differently. I mean, so Somalia isn't a place we abandon just because the governance is, rock bottom. It means we just have to work through different entities. We have to be very historically aware of the context, be very acutely aware of the political economy, and be very aware of how we have to sequence the politics, but providing absolutely essential support for education and healthcare and so on. So you build up the human capacity to build a new nation. So these things have to come together.
Can I clarify my point on good governance? Because
yes.
I don't have a high standard on governance here. I mean, I thought those figures that Michael gave were very interesting. Yeah. Here, I said a government's committed to poverty reduction and things we want to do. If you've got a government like Afghanistan and you're able to achieve those sort of results, then I'm happy with that. I'm not saying government has to tick every single box. I worked for quite a number of years in Bangladesh, and in many ways a bloody awful government, series of bloody awful governments, but actually they were delivering results for poor people. Mm. And that's okay for
So I was going to ask you if you had a benchmark below which aid shouldn't be given. I mean,
Well, I think there are some governments to which you would not want to give any aid. I mean, I think Mugabe's government in Zimbabwe, and most aid donors stopped giving aid to the government. They didn't stop trying to do things in Zimbabwe. I mean, very few of those things made much difference to the government situation in Zimbabwe or economic growth, but they did help keep people alive, which is a good thing to do. So the way in which you deliver aid does vary depending on the level of governance. If you want to get the best results, you go to the governments that are doing the most positive things. In the areas that you've got poor governance, you have to think, as Michael I think has indicated, you have to deliver your aid in different ways.
I'd like to move on to another one, starting with you, Dorcas. But if anybody's got any questions after this, we can start opening up for questions. I want to go back to the 1970s when we were talking about aid being equal, pretty much, between what was going to Vietnam and Cambodia after that tragedy, and when our television screens were full of that, and aid that was going to Africa was pretty much equal. But now, as Paul was saying, it's shifted, and Africa for the past 10 years or so has been the focus of that. What did Asia do that Africa's not doing? And what did the West or the UN or whoever's responsible do in Asia that it's not doing in Africa, or how does it work? Could you throw a bit of light on that?
Oh
for us,
gosh,
folks?
this is stuff that my father and I discuss a lot. You know, him being of the sort of Pan-Africanist bent, and seeing Ghana come to independence, and you know all the optimism within Nkrumah, and say, hey, what happened to us? What happened to Ghana? Why are all of these people speeding ahead? And there are many different reasons. I remember studying at university too, and it was very contentious. You had people on one side of the room saying it's because you've got bad governments, you don't know how to manage your affairs in Africa, and this is the problem. And then you had other people who talked about, well, if you look at the state in which a lot of these countries were left after independence in the 50s and the 60s and some in the 70s, where you're starting off from, and you think about how many graduates were in that country. You know, some countries had like 14 university graduates for the whole country. And then you think, how were these people going to be able to sort of lift their nations in that period of time? You didn't have the same sort of correlation in Asia, where you had loads of very more educated people as well. So you have to look at that. So for one, I think the question is unfair because the comparison is not like for like. And secondly, you know, you also have to think, you know, Africa was the theater for the Cold War. You know, it was cold everywhere else, but it was very hot, as we say, in Africa.
Oh, it's very hot in Vietnam as well.
True. I'm not slithering out of it entirely, but.
No, it's not a slither out of. It's what are the you've identified education. Give us very briefly a couple of more benchmarks. Or it is education, is it?
Education is one, but also it goes back to how that kind of aid was delivered, how Africa was seen within the sort of geopolitical context at that time. You know, those sort of things count, which is why we are all like here talking about what this new reallocation of funding will mean in terms of like countries that are not defined in the same way. These kind of decisions have an impact on the progress that these kind of countries can make, you know, needing that kind of focus and giving aid in a certain way. And also the issues of trade as well, you know, one of the loved, academics, you know, that Andrew Mitchell loves and loads of donors love is Paul Collier, isn't he? And he talks about like how certain countries can't move out of different positions. It reminds me a bit, I don't think you would appreciate the comparison, but of what Emmanuel Wallerstein used to say about the division of different countries in the world, but hashed up in a very new sort of marketable way for different donors. But there are those kind of questions. How easily can a continent like Africa move into the new growing economy with all the different issues of trade and access to markets? You know, we need to talk about that.
We've got we've been talking for centuries on this issue, trying to get some answers. Does the Western donors view different places differently and treat them differently? So apart from, you know, everything's different, is Africa in the 1976 or 77, say, treated differently to Vietnam or Cambodia, which is sort of what Dorcas was saying, or is there a general universality about aid and how it's used?
Well, one thing, there's diversity within East Asia. I mean, one of the interesting stories in East Asia is the Philippines, which in many ways has had a lot of the advantages of a lot of other East Asian countries, and yet has been unable to generate an industrial base of any kind, remains highly dependent on exporting labor and so on. And I think the best analysis I've read about that suggests it has a lot to do with the political economy of the Philippines, about the way in which the politics and the economics interact, and the kinds of incentives governments have to apportion resources among the elite and so on. And so it's just, you know, there is no substitute for taking each country on its own terms and looking at its own particular historical endowment and what the political economy is. I don't think that there was any sort of discrimination between Africa and Asia. There were
or Middle East or Latin America.
I think there were very different starting positions. I think that Africa did become wrapped up in the Cold War in a slightly different way from even Vietnam and Cambodia. But I don't think aid was, I go back to aid is not that big of a determinant of these things. That
Okay, so what then, Paul, is the mechanism that has flipped East Asia ahead?
I think there are three explanatory variables there. One is that they invested very significantly in basic health and education.
The donors or the countries?
The countries, basically, but
yeah.
donors obviously were supporting. And that didn't happen to anything like the same extent in Africa. Secondly, they were basically open economies. Trade was an important part. Doesn't mean the government wasn't involved, but they were basically very open to trade. That is very much contrast to the rather inward-looking trade policies that many African countries adopted during that period. Thirdly, they were basically open to the private sector. The role of the state was seen, there was an active role of the state, but it was largely supportive of the private sector. They took particular sectors that they wanted to develop, they helped to develop them, and then they moved out. Very different to the strategies in Africa, which tended to be, the philosophies were that the state had to do things, the state had to invest in productive capacity, and then built up these large enterprises that we've all seen around the place, and they've just fallen apart. I think the combination of those three factors basically explains what happened.
Samir, was looking at the conflict there, because East Asia came out of conflict and Africa's sort of moved with certain countries are. Is there a particular trick that's being missed somewhere that you've identified?
I mean, I think the issue is that how we understand conflict, and as I was mentioning before, I think we often see conflict as kind of as a failure of development, and I think that conflict also, creates new processes of economic accumulation. It creates new processes of social regulation. Some of them can be quite regressive, but some of them can be quite progressive as well. They can lead to changes in distribution of wealth, they can lead to emancipation of women, they can lead to greater inequality within society. So I think that we need to kind of maybe step away from this idea that conflict is automatically a bad thing. I mean, it's obviously bad due to the human consequences that it creates, but then also that there are processes that maybe we can pull out of conflict that might have a more developmental outcome.
I've always wondered what would happen if the UN had intervened in the American Civil War and was still there on the line. Right, I think we've got a hand here, and then we'll go there, and then we'll go there. Yeah.
At the moment when China gives aid, it doesn't enforce governance. So how will we work with countries like that? Another question was I wanted to ask, do countries, when they give aid, do they work in competition with each other, or do they work together? And thirdly was, when I was in Kosovo this last year, what I saw with Britain's help was that they did a lot of good work in Kosovo, and yet all the business was going to Germany. So that is when we give aid, how will the British policy will be in terms of increasing trade between those countries as well?
Well, that last one's a bit of a story of our own history, actually, isn't it? But I'm so glad you asked that, because we we didn't have time to get rid of the China, get onto the China issue here, of how important China is and whether we're going to be working as a sort of between rival powers, or whether we can work in partnership with China. That's essentially what you're looking at. Very quickly, let's get an answer to that, and then we'll find out what's actually going on. From Paul.
China is massively important and becoming increasingly important. You have to go around Africa, and you see the range of investments that China is making in Africa. And it's there's a lot of speculation about what its motivations are. Some is clearly natural resource based, but not entirely. I was at a time in Ethiopia. Massive Chinese investment, well, there are no resources there to get hold of anything worth talking about anyway. That China's particularly interested. So it's more than that. It's more about influence. It's more about positioning themselves in the world as well. They operate in a very different way. What will be interesting to see is whether, as they mature as a donor, they start to have some of the issues that we, as the more mature donors, do. And we're beginning to see some indications of that, I think, that they are beginning to realise that the issues of governance, of social conditions and those sort of things are pertinent to their investments. So I think, they are where we were perhaps 40, 50 years ago in their approach to development. And I think we're going to see some very significant changes in the Chinese approach to aid. We need to talk to them. I know DFID have been busy trying to talk to the Chinese. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. I think this is a thing to watch.
Yes, I mean, I was in Tanzania a few weeks ago, and we drove in to interview the Chinese ambassador. And it was the first time in my career that I've gone and interviewed a Chinese ambassador on foreign soil on a global policy issue.
Exactly.
And usually you go and see the Americans. You used to go and see the British. But it's... Samir, what do you...
I mean, I'd agree. I mean, I think that we do, China has greater influence, and I think we would be a bit naive to think that, well, I guess kind of trying to judge them that, national kind of interests kind of influence their aid programs. I think, if we look back historically, the same rationale, if you like, it has been used for, Western donors in terms of giving aid. And I think that they do have increasing influence. And I mean, if you take an example like Sri Lanka, where the Chinese government does have a lot of influence and Western donors have very little influence, I think it would be very naive not to engage with the Chinese in order to see how Western donors can also be part of the development debates in those contexts.
Is this issue, Dorcas, about governance, that the Chinese will come in and they'll build the railway or build the hospital, build whatever they're going to build, and there's nothing about democracy, nothing about all of those things that we're meant to hold dear? Is that important?
It is important, and I do agree that China is a very important player, but I think we're kind of forgetting a whole group of people in this equation, which is the people in that country as well, who, if we invest in civil society in terms of monitoring, in terms of being able to have a free and independent and robust media to look at these kind of issues, maybe some of these sort of things won't be as concern. And I think we do have to look at the diplomatic efforts and how we bring China into some of the standards that some of the donors have got in terms of human rights. But we also need to really look at the other side of the equation. It's a very sort of top-level discussion that's happened about, oh, China's going into all these countries. What are we going to do to bring them around? Well, it's the people in those countries who be able to sort of drive those things about accountability, about monitoring, and about human rights abuses. So let's invest in media in those countries as well to keep the Chinese to account.
But Michael, do we need China to do that, or isn't it quite a good thing is that we deal with the democracy and the good governance and all that, and they build the dams and the bridges and we don't have to build that anymore? And is this a sort of quite a good partnership that could...
Well, I mean, China's not going to send in Human Rights Watch next week to monitor programs. They're in a different place and they have a different approach. I think what I would say is, there's real evidence that China has made a very positive contribution to development in a number of countries. We are very interested in working closely with them. We've just had the Africa-China dialogue where we had last week, where we had a representative. Chinese delegations have come to DFID 3 times to find out how we do aid. We've been told, so I'm going to praise myself now, we've been told that we are the gold standard in terms of a development agency, and they're really, really keen to learn what DFID does. And they're not going to copy everything we do, but they're very interested in copying some of it. The only thing I think I would say is that these partnerships, in the new world we're in, these partnerships are going to be absolutely critical, and the UK government's very committed to working hard on building the partnerships. But it's not just China. China gets all the press, but pay attention, folks, to Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, India, of course, gets a lot of press, Indonesia, Mexico. These countries are having a big global footprint, and we're not really seeing as much of it in the media as we probably need to be.
So when we pledged our 0.7% some years back of our GDP for aid, these players weren't around. So do we now have to give less?
Well, no, they were around. I think we weren't paying as much attention to them. I think we were not as aware.
So can we look at the budget again?
Well, I mean, look, for us, 0.7 is good for the UK, and it's good for our global footprint. I mean, there's a very strong commitment among all three political parties to go for that, and it's a strong place to be. It is the case that a lot of the aid that is coming out of these kind of emerging powers is often much more closely linked to their national self-interest than we would find comfortable. In the UK, we are governed by the International Development Act, which says aid has to be about poverty reduction as primary purpose. And if you think that's not going on, you can take us to court and challenge us. China doesn't have that. Turkey doesn't have that. That's not the case.
Isn't it? Nobody's taking you to court, though.
As of this afternoon, I hadn't heard of anybody taking us to court. But I mean, the point is that the objectives of the UK aid program administered by DFID are subject to judicial scrutiny, and that it is all geared around poverty reduction being the primary purpose, along with humanitarian assistance, so on. So, it would be unrealistic to expect these other countries to have the exact same purposes and values that we have, and we need to be realistic about that.
But you can still work with them.
And still work together in a pragmatic way.
Let's take about 3 questions and hope that they all fall into something. Can you actually say who you are, or if you represent anybody and all the rest of it? Yeah. And then over there.
Sure. My name is Rashid Hassan, and I'm from Somaliland, not from Somalia, and I will explain what I mean. And first of all, I just wanted to say a few words about the proper aid. I agree, although you cannot measure the type of a government, I think it is very important that there is a basic issues. For example, if the government is encouraging democracy, if it is encouraging freedom of the press, is encouraging women's rights and so on. This is the basic, I think, issues that we share generally. That is one of the factors. So, and coming from Somaliland, and I hope you are aware, between Somaliland and Somalia, we talk about, for example, the Sharif government and the Al-Shabaab and so on. Somaliland is a country that was British protectorate. It withdrew from the Union of Somalia in 1991. Now, though it is not recognized, it did 2 presidential elections. The last one was June. And the one parliamentary election, we have 2 councils, the Council of Elders.
I'm sorry to interrupt on that. It's very nice to know this.
Yeah.
Is there a question that
question,
you could ask?
yes, question. And then I will exactly now come into the question. The question let me finish that first, just 1 minute. It's the reason that Somaliland was first colonized by British and became British protectorate, because it was the British presence is in Aden. I'm talking about the age of colonization. It was the British garrison where they were getting their supply of meat. And still Somaliland, therefore, this border in that sense, because mentioning Yemen, we're facing just Yemen on the side of the Red Sea. And so my question is,
thank you.
Do you have, for example, really know what Somaliland is? It's a different from Somalia. Do you know that we have an election recently? Do you have the new perspective is that you relate to development, aid now, which is actually terrorism, or also piracy. This is the countries that deserve to be helped. People like me who educated, for example, here and so on, all went back. We are helping that country. So this is the place that I think need more. So are you aware of that country?
So
that's
your
what
question
is
should we look at Somaliland?
Somaliland
as a
different
as a
entity,
model
as a
of
different
something that
country,
can
as a model.
Brilliant.
As a model of people became what you are expecting, what
Okay.
the taxpayers expecting from them. So that's the question I'm asking.
Thank you very much. And just at the back in the middle there, this gentleman there, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Dan Pimlott. I'm a journalist with the FT. I write about economics. It's a question for Michael, really. If you look at the spending plans over the next few years, although by 2014-15 we get up to 0.7% of GDP, it's not until about 2013-14 I think you actually see a jump in spending, and most of that time you're pretty flat. And I know that some sort of aid organisations have been worried that maybe that leaves the government with some leeway to sort of change their mind at the last minute. I just wondered how sure and how locked down we are, or that we're actually going to reach that 0.7%. And secondly, we're seeing this redirection of aid towards the sort of defence goals, towards the areas where we have defence concerns. It's interesting that you say that we have sort of legal rights to sort of challenge the uses of aid. In what ways do you think that how DFID is sort of carrying out this aid is going to change? And to what extent are the controls on the ability of DFID to stop itself becoming a sort of outsourced Ministry of Defence department, sort of carrying out hearts and minds operations?
Okay. Let's take one more. There was a gentleman at the back there. Yes, that hand there. All right, we'll go right to the back, and then we'll do you the first one next time. Yeah.
Sorry, I hope you don't mind me standing. I'm not usually used to using
a question
microphones.
though, but not a history
Yes,
lesson.
it is a question. It is a question. It won't be a history lesson. I'm from Uganda, a country that enormously benefits from your aid. In fact, our budget pleasantly enjoys a massive amount of aid. But the big question is, why do donors fail to really scrutinize the way this aid is used? Do you have a backup plan or a plan put forward to actually follow up this aid? We've had several instances where you have the Gavi funds that have been misappropriated. This has been a thing that has gone on over the years, and nothing has been done by the donors. All the donors do is pump more aid, pump more aid, pump more aid. And I think, as an African or as a Ugandan, I'm asking, why don't you put in place systems that can actually look at this aid, follow it up to the core people who need it, the common people down in the villages who have no medicine in the hospitals, no transportation, nothing completely to their name apart from corrupt officials who pleasantly enjoy this donor money? Thank you.
Thank you. Nice question. I just want to tackle the Somaliland one. Is that, Samir, perhaps, is there a model country that one can put up and say, this is how we did it, it worked?
Well, I mean, I think with Somaliland, there's important lessons to be learned how kind of indigenous processes and internal processes had kind of taken it out, if you like, from its from the same kind of path as Somalia, and it's kind of dealing with fragility. And I don't think, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but that the international donors played a particularly significant role in the stability that exists in Somaliland. So I think it's a place where there's potentially important lessons for kind of seeing what kind of domestic forces, lead to stability, and how can we support those.
Are there other countries? I mean, I know every country is different, but are there other models, beacons that can be held up, as this gentleman's holding up Somaliland?
I mean, I think that there's not necessarily beacons, but I mean, there are signs of progress. I mean, if you look at, for example, Colombia, in the last since 2002, it's made massive progress in terms of ensuring security and improving security. And it's done that with quite a strong kind of, state apparatus in enforcing that, quite a strong security apparatus. Maybe hasn't been so concerned with human rights issues, but it claims that, it has created stability. And if you look at the statistics of violence, they have gone down quite dramatically. So I think there's often trade-offs to be made. And, I think, I guess we have to make sometimes hard decisions about, the countries we support, particularly with issues around kind of human rights.
Okay. On the budget, I think we'll come to you on this one, and also this sort of shifting it into defence or outsourcing defence. Do we go to court, as you just said, and said it's not being used for poverty reduction, and how's it going to work?
Well, let me answer that, but I also a couple I missed last time. On that one. Look, it remains the case that on the order of 88 to 90% of all UK overseas development assistance will go through DFID. Some others will go through Foreign Office and Department of Energy and Climate Change and so on. That's
from the DFID budget, or
no,
or from another budget?
The amount of money that counts as overseas development assistance, about 88 to 90% over this spending review period will go through DFID.
Okay.
The rest goes through other government departments. That's a long-standing historical case. It's been like that for many years, that other departments have some money which they spend as ODA. Of the money that goes to DFID, it is all governed by the International Development Act 2002, and it covers, the rule there is that all aid must be spent either for humanitarian assistance or it must be spent with the primary purpose of poverty reduction. That doesn't mean it can't do other things as well, but that all aid we spend to Afghanistan and elsewhere must have a poverty reduction function to it. And that's legally binding.
Are there any moves afoot to change that legislation that you know of?
No, it's not a fig leaf. I mean, we are very bound by the rule of law here. We know that there is an effective judicial review system. Those of you with longer memories will remember the Pergao Dam case of 1988-89, when there was the use of the aid budget was tried in court and it was found to be improper. So we know people are watching. There's accountability. I'm proud to say the UK is the only donor country I know of which has this kind of absolutely hard legal accountability in place, where it's possible for any citizen of this country acting pro bono to go to the court and say, actually, it's not being used well. That's a kind of form of accountability that no other donor government has entered into as far as
Very
I'm aware.
quickly, are you going to meet the 0.7% target?
Oh, yeah, sorry, in Dan's question. Look, I mean, we're heading for 0.56 in the next 2 years. We'll hit 0.7 in 2013, and then in 2014, I think we'll manage that without a problem. I mean, there'll be some tweaks here and there, and who knows what's going to happen to the GNI, gross national income. But projections are good. Are we going to stick with that? The government is committed to legislating on it. More scary than that is Treasury has said it's going to happen. And Treasury is, if you live in Whitehall, Treasury is a formidable force to deal with. I'm highly confident it's going to happen. Can I just, Humphrey, answer a couple other questions?
Sure. Yep.
One was a question about Kosovo and trade.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't talked much about trade, but the UK puts a lot of effort into promoting trade. South-South trade between North-South, and the effort in Kosovo promoting trade is through the EU mainly. It's true Germany has historical links. You asked also about aid. Do donors compete or do they cooperate? Huge structures to promote cooperation, and that's much of the aid effectiveness agenda is about that. So there's very strong cooperation. There is occasionally competition, but the cooperation is very strong.
Can I jump in there? I mean,
Please.
You talk about trade. We're going off on a tangent. I'm going to get back in a second to this question. But you talk about promoting trade, but one of the big problems in Africa that you hear all the time is the tariffs of exporting to the European Union and elsewhere, and now the tariff-less exports to China. What is going to happen to drop those tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, actually, under Europe, the everything but arms arrangement, for which I'm very pleased to say, the rules of origin under the everything but arms arrangement have just changed. So actually, Europe is very open to trade, and actually, the U.S. has. For a raw commodity.
Yes. It doesn't cost much in tariffs, but if you're making something in Africa and exporting to the European Union, it costs an awful lot. That's why they can't manufacture and sell to Europe.
Well, no, that's not true. The
That's what you're hearing there.
In Africa?
In Africa, yes.
Okay, I have to hear more details, but I mean, the formal rules are not like that under the everything but arms arrangement.
That's a myth that has to be exploded.
I mean, what is the case is that a lot of African countries are importing from China because they get cheaper goods, and so there are very strong trade links, and there's good trade finance.
This question was very close to my heart, having been up into Uganda and heard exactly what I heard from the back room there, not from the same gentleman, I must say. And I wonder if Samir and Paul could I mean, you go to Kampala, and I actually, when I was driving around Kampala, having never been there before, thought that what I thought were five-star hotels were in fact the World Food Programme office and the WHO office and the UNICEF office. And I looked at these places and wondered what all these people were doing in there. And then you talk to people on the ground, and whether it's right or wrong, as we've discussed these myths, you do find that they think that 50 to 60% of the money that's allocated goes on these offices and hotels and all that sort of stuff. And then you go up to places like Karamoja, and people are dirt poor and nothing gets there, and the money goes missing on the way. And there's no scrutiny. I'll come back to you on this at the end, but Dorcas, what is the impressions in Africa itself, and can it be more closely scrutinized?
Well, you often hear this from a lot of the diaspora groups that I'm involved in out of ActionAid, just as another African interested in, like, my own continent's development. And it's true, we worry about where aid is going, how it's supposed to be spent, and also about scrutiny of donors. But I do know that DFID has in the past, cancelled projects around budget support when it felt it hasn't met certain standards. So I know that it does have the capacity to do so, and it needs to make a value judgment as to whether that would be good or not. But for us as ActionAid, it really does always go back to how can we empower people to be able to take that to the government, to take that to their own government, to demand what's happening. So one of the challenging countries we work in around situations like that is in Kenya, where we have supported a local radio station where we constantly, like, you know, feed in all the information we're finding about corruption in their certain community. Say, hey, you're supposed to get this amount of money. Look at what's happening. And we've managed to get people fired. We've done this in Ethiopia, sometimes at cost. You know, sometimes at cost. Some of the work we've done has meant that some of our staff are being put in prison, you know, and have had to do quite, you know, a lot of very uncomfortable things to bring the truth to light. But it's something that is an ongoing process. Now, you take that argument and then you also have to take the other one, which is more difficult, which is like, so do you withdraw aid in those circumstances? And I'm not sure, again, I would feel comfortable going to those absolute circumstances, because as you will know yourself, as the gentleman asked, there are so many different parts of a government in the country that you're working in. And it's also quite simplistic to maybe present every government official in every certain kinds of African countries as corrupt. There are lots of, like, you know, very energetic people in the diaspora community who've gone back home, you know, who are working in some of these governments to try and, like, check all of these things. And it's a long battle, so it's a two-way street. It's a very sort of intuitive thing to say, this is terrible, we need to stop all of this. But we need to look at how diverse that picture is and things that we can support.
Do we keep a close enough check on it? I mean, Andrew Mitchell said before he came into office that he was going to turn the whole thing up on its head and create a...
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, I don't know Uganda, so I can't comment. But I find it very difficult to recognise the situation that was being described there. I have run aid programs in a number of countries, and I've worked very closely with representatives from a range of other aid agencies, and the idea that they are not all very, very aware that they need to be fully accountable for the aid. There's any number of evaluators and auditors who are checking up. So
it doesn't need this new
yeah, I was going to
organisation.
I don't think it does. In fact, I believe that that is the new organisation we set up is actually going to add very little value for a number of reasons which we needn't go into. I actually think there's a danger that the more didn't develop the issues about risk. We ought to be taking risk in the development business. It's a difficult business. We ought to be taking risk. Setting up more and more accountability mechanisms which are checking up all the time actually will make aid administrators risk averse. And that is a major threat to the effectiveness of aid. So in trying to improve the quality may have a perverse effect actually in producing less effective aid. That's my worry.
And we can sell that risk to the public, can we? They will accept, they're intelligent enough to accept it?
I would hope they are, but the media doesn't seem to be very good at putting the argument
very
across.
intelligent on these issues. We've got a...
Sorry, can I just quickly comment? I do think the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which is being set up, which is going to report directly to Parliament on scrutinising aid across all of government, not just DFID, but all ODA in the UK government. I think it is a good thing. It's going to provide another level of scrutiny, and we owe it to UK taxpayers as well as beneficiaries to show that we're delivering. I think that Paul is absolutely right, though. Risk-taking is essential to this business, and we are. The Secretary of State is very clear. He's determined to maintain that risk-taking, even though we're going to be accountable.
We've been very nice. Can I take one issue? The one thing that did worry me, I saw this week, the chap who's been appointed as the head of the ICIA, as far as I could see, had no experience of aid. He's an accountant. My father was an accountant, and you know that really frightens me. I mean, I do hope that on that body there will be some people who understand the aid business, because if you take a strict auditor's approach to what we're trying to do in the aid business and judge us by that, it's going to cause you enormous headaches, Michael.
I think you'll be very pleased with the Commission when it's finalised.
Okay,
there's one here. We'll take another 3 or 4. Yeah. That's it.
Graham Lee from the NGO Global Witness on the issue of accountability in aid. Graham Lee from the NGO Global Witness on the issue of accountability in aid. Michael, I'd like to draw you back to one of the statistics that you gave us earlier on about aid in Afghanistan. And 15% of Afghans previously having had access to basic healthcare, and now 85% of Afghans having access to basic healthcare, if I remember correctly. Now that immediately put me in mind of a documentary by the French filmmakers Premier Lins, who took Sarkozy's commitment about the French aid to Afghanistan as building 600 schools, and they went to Afghanistan and they couldn't find a single one. And certainly the last time I was in Afghanistan, I shared a taxi to the Pakistani border with a family who were taking their young child to hospital in Peshawar because they couldn't find reasonable healthcare in Kabul. And I was wondering how we can be assured that our government aren't spinning the figures on aid in the same way that the French are.
Okay. Let's take another lady there, and then over there. And we'll
Thank you. Caroline Pym, J. Clark Charitable Trust, Empowerment of Women Initiative. First of all, I'd like to endorse what you said about Rwanda. We have a project in Rwanda, Dreaded Word Project. I was there 18 months ago. I happened to be watching telly. Not only does Rwanda collect, and this is DFID, not only does it collect more tax per capita than any other country in Africa, but they're actually now apparently better than we are. They were given the software by the DFID and they've improved it. So, anyway, thank you.
doing well, aren't you? Yeah.
So, sorry, I've got a question from Michael from the DFID. I would like to know a few details about what, if anything, the DFID is doing for women in Afghanistan. I don't mean in Kabul. I don't mean the city, I mean out in Paktia province, right out in the country. And also, if it's not too detailed, how the DFID works through the provincial reconstruction teams, and whether in fact they're able to do anything in Helmand province. Thank you.
There. And then there, and then we'll have to wrap it up because I've just noticed we're almost out of time.
Mary Holmes, I'm just an interested individual. I don't think we've heard nearly enough about trade. How are we thinking countries that we give aid to are going to earn a living? I mean, it's all very well to talk about women having projects and microfinance, but really I think in my lifetime some countries have been de-industrialized. I mean, Africa used to have factories making textiles and things, and now they often don't. I mean, I know there are many different countries, different situations. I agree with Humphrey. Cocoa gets a very low tariff and chocolate gets a very high tariff. I mean, I may be, not totally correct on everything, but, it is very difficult. Countries are not encouraged to sell processed goods in every sort of way. If you look at Haiti, it used to grow rice, then it was flooded with American rice very cheaply, and now it's got nothing, and the countryside is denuded of trees and so on. I think the Western world holds the rest of the world in an arm lock about trade, and we make the rules about these things. How are we going to expect countries to earn a living? So that's my main point. Right? Look at America. It subsidizes cotton, and 4 African countries have gone out of business. I mean, it's kind of, I'm all for aid. I think it's wonderful, and I hope it does work. But we have to bear in mind that it comes in the world as it is, and it's not a very benign world for developing countries.
And just the gentleman next door.
Thank you. My name's Michael Wells. I'm just an ordinary human being. Couple of points following on from the previous speaker about Burkina Faso is a country that produced cotton more competitively than America, couldn't sell it to America because American farmers subsidised their cotton producers. So, hello for trade. Before we get too self-congratulatory about the government ring-fencing DFID, I think if we're talking about an £8 billion budget, that's still what this year the estimated amount of bonuses in the City of London paid out will be 7 billion. So, again, 8 billion or 12 billion or however much it is by 2050, it's peanuts. And I'd just like to develop Dorcas's point about when you're discussing Asia and Africa and development over 20 years, there's a huge lot of woolliness about the concept of development. Zaire, which was the Belgian Congo, which became Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo, when Mobutu Sese Seko took over, there were 3 university graduates. It's a huge country made up of very diverse peoples. The idea of a nation or a nation state in development is also it's something that really we need to, well, maybe not need, but we need to understand how different the concept of a nation or a state is across the world. And I think coming back to what Paul has said is that, you know, this poverty reduction, let's just try and get poverty down. Let's not have these great, you know, grandiose post-colonial notions about how we're going to transform the world. Let's just try and help people who are poor.
Okay. Thank you. We'll just Paul, could you pick up on this point that seems to have just come through in the last two questions? This idea that I'd forgotten about, that the farmers in Africa, for example, are told that they can't have any subsidies because that's how free markets work. Yet in the European Union, we know that to stop conflict after the Second World War, we subsidised and still subsidise all the farmers, so there's no war in Europe. And then there's the tariff thing, which on the cocoa was brought through on a finding. So are we living in two different worlds here? We have our world, which we know how it works, and therefore we subsidise farmers, we have free trade and all the rest of it. And then we look at the developing world, and we say, well, they're not going to have the things that give us wealth and security, but we'll tell them that they have to have a different model.
So you're wanting consistency in international policy?
Correct, yes, please. We want to finish this in the next 5 minutes with answers. But is that essentially what's going on?
Yeah, I think there is. There is great inconsistency. That's quite clear. There's different standards are being applied. I mean, I don't think we should be encouraging any country to think that building up anything, be it an industry or an agricultural, on the basis of subsidies is sustainable. Sustainable. I mean, we in Europe have paid an enormous price for those agricultural subsidies. I mean, I guess most of us here are not farmers, you know, have paid a very, very high price for preserving the.
But we paid an enormous price for not having them in the First and Second World Wars, didn't we? And that's essentially what's happening in Africa and in many places, such as Ivory Coast, over the cocoa and that sort of thing.
No, I mean, without going into trade economics, I mean, if you have free trade, you know, trade economics will tell you that all countries will be able to develop a comparative advantage in it. You know, it's but the problem is we haven't got a level playing field, and that's absolutely right, and I completely agree. And I agree with everything that's said about the need for more open Western markets. But of course, it's an EU competence trade, and therefore it plays into very complicated politics within Europe. It's not within DFID's or even with the British government's sole.
But if Samir, if Western governments are now saying, as DFID is, that we're going to put this money into fragile states and conflict zones, and you have this huge issue that's just been highlighted and Paul's agreed with, to what extent, in your experience, is this trade imbalance fueling the fragility of the states and the conflict, or is it not an issue?
Well, I mean, I think you have to go for context by context, but I don't think necessarily that trade imbalances necessarily cause fragility in many contexts, but it might be an impediment to their own economic growth and their own development. So I think we'd have to kind of try to understand what are some of the kind of structural factors within the international global economy that might impede some of these kind of fragile states integrating themselves better within the economy and being able to kind of follow a more developmentalist trajectory.
Is this the elephant in the room as opposed to building the water standpipe?
I mean, I think it is to a certain extent. I think a lot of the times when we talk about development more broadly, I think there's obviously often a lack of historical memory about the way that, you know, our own societies developed and the time that it took and some of the roles that states have played and some of the regulations and subsidies and other mechanisms that are put in place to kind of help facilitate that trajectory. But I think often when we kind of think about the development of a lot of developing nations, I think there is a tendency to kind of forget some of the more structural factors, such as, you know, unequal playing field that there is, particularly around trade. So I think when we do talk about trying to achieve greater coherence across government, I think we do need to start thinking about, well, what are our own interests in, for example, the current trade structure, and how can we amend that to facilitate more some of our developmental objectives?
Dorcas, is this a red herring, or is it really a sort of a very big issue?
I think it's a very big issue, and it brings us neatly back to where we started, which is aid is a very small part of what makes development. You know, development is about structural change. It is about trade issues. It is about tax evasion. It's about good corporate behavior. And those are much harder to tackle, you know, than necessarily sort of like giving aid. That's what will bring real development. So I do applaud the government for ring fencing aid. But you know what? I'll be like breaking open the champagne and doing loads of fireworks when we see action on tax evasion, international tax evasion, when we see action on corporate behavior from the government tackling some of the corporate abuses. And then when we do see some good action on fairer trade for developing countries, now that would be really transformative development.
So when the government talks about Afghanistan, Pakistan, these places that are now in the news every day, they need to be tackling these issues as well.
Yes.
Otherwise it's just going to go round and round in circles.
Yes, that's what we believe. So we look forward to hearing more details in your bilateral aid review as to how all of these issues will play.
And Michael, I've got a note here to ask you. The key bit, I think, was I can't remember who asked the question, but are all the figures wrong? Are they cooking the books? I mean, can we believe anything that we've...
We really strongly believe, and Andrew Mitchell's taken a personal leadership role in this, that transparency is absolutely vital. So there's the UK Aid Transparency Guarantee, which he announced shortly after coming into office, that all DFID's aid from next year is going to be, they will be published on the web. You can see exactly where the money's going. So it goes back to this point about accountability. Every payment over £500 is going to be published to who it was made to and what was for, so people will be able to see, and people in developing countries will be able to see exactly where it's going. Part of the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is transparency about the figures, and it's really important. I mean, this question about are we spinning the numbers, well, not deliberately. It is possible the numbers are inaccurate, and the truth is in a lot of these countries it's quite hard to get good stats. But you know, it's not in our interest, if we want to know what's working, to try to spin the numbers this year, because it'll just make it harder next year. So we are working with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the UN, to try to improve the quality of statistics gathered. And the Afghanistan numbers, you know, it's possible that particularly there are patches where that 85% is not being reached. Also,
well, he didn't see any schools or any hospital. What was it? Whatever you were looking for, you didn't find, right?
Well, I wasn't looking. I was mainly referring to this documentary by the French filmmaker Premier League, which you can find on YouTube, and it's very informative. I was speaking also from personal experience of there being having found very little perception from ordinary Afghans that they do have access to healthcare.
Yeah.
Certainly no improvements in healthcare within the last 10 years of foreign engagement.
So you've got the figures.
While I'm shooting my mouth off, I'd like to perhaps question your assertion that there is nothing in spinning in the figures for DFID, because DFID also has an interest in creating the perception of there being viable aid to Afghanistan in order to create the conditions for withdrawal.
Okay, don't address that. I just wanted to ask you the final question, then we're going to wrap up, is that given what emerged here about this trade imbalance, the big elephant in the room that's come out, is Andrew Mitchell or are you going to be talking to the European Commission, to people to try to get this? Is there a lobby to get it moved, or is everybody happy with the way it is?
we have a joint, with Biz department, we have a joint trade and development team, which is 18 people, and they work full-time on trade issues. They spend a huge amount of time lobbying the EU.
It hasn't moved in 50 years, though, has it?
No, it's moved a great deal. There's huge improvements in terms. I mean, look at the Bangladesh success story, which is about garment exports. Enormous. That would not be possible without getting better trade deals. Now, we've got the Doha Development Agreement ahead of us, and the negotiations are quite stuck, mainly because of where the U.S. is at the moment. But we've been working very hard with European partners to help get things positioned, so if we get a little bit of movement from the U.S. Congress, we can move forward on that. That would be incredibly important, because the big thing, you're absolutely right about this, is agriculture is the area that has been excluded for a long time, and the subsidies, the perverse subsidies that exist, cannot exist forever. They have to be tackled. And one of the great things, actually, about the emerging powers coming up, the Chinas and Indias and so on, is they're not going to tolerate Europe and North America having these perverse incentives forever. The power is shifting.
Because they can sell to China for no tariffs.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody here, for putting my learning curve way up here, certainly. And thank you all for coming, and let's give them all a round of applause.